Hello, I'm going to do chapter 3. It's called Secondary Data, Literature Reviews, and Hypotheses. So we're going to go over what the learning objectives are and basically a little summary of each learning objective. So the learning objectives are understanding the nature and role of secondary data, describing and conducting a literature review, and many of us have conducted literature reviews for class, but this is a little bit of a different kind of a literature review. Identifying the sources of internal versus external secondary data, discussing and conceptualizing the role of this data in model development, and then understanding what hypotheses are, and then hypotheses as they're related to independent and dependent variables. So first, understanding the nature and role of secondary data. So in secondary data, you've got, it helps us in the decision-making process. And there are 6 fundamentals that you want to consider when you're looking at secondary data. First is, what is the purpose of the research that you're doing? How relevant is the data to achieving what your specific research goals are? How accurate is the information? So when you're trying to look at secondary data, you're not always sure what the primary purpose was for collecting that data, nor are you absolutely positive in all cases of what how accurate the information is or how accurate would be for your purposes. Third is consistency. So are there multiple sources of data that exist that would validate or confirm each of the sources, or that would help you to have a better understanding of whether or not the data is accurate? Fourth is credibility, and that kind of comes back to the idea of the accuracy and the consistency of where and how was the data obtained, who was it that was responsible for collecting it. If it's an internal source, I think you'll be able to get a much better idea of what the accuracy and the consistency is. If it's external sources that you're going to, that's where you might need to do a little bit more probing to find out whether or not that data is going to be credible. The fifth is what the methodology was. So what was the reason? How did they go about collecting the data? Were they doing it in a scientific kind of a way, or was there going to be some sort of a bias, which takes us to the sixth principle. Biases are, and we've all heard some of these of, well, you question who is it that is conducting the research. So if you're looking at some sort of a soap, and it's the soap manufacturer that's actually collected the data, you may call into question whether or not they had some ulterior motive in the way that they collected the data. Now, if you were looking on the externally. Internally, you would hope that you would be able to look a little bit more deeply again and understand whether or not the methods that were used in order to collect the data were fair and not biased. So the second second objective that I want to cover today is describing how to conduct a literature review. Again, I talked about conducting a literature review for the reports that we've all had to do in college. This is a similar kind of an idea, but we're being a little bit more selective in the kind of literature that we'll be looking at. So a literature review is comprehensive. It's a comprehensive examination of the information that's available out there, either online or in a book format, or you have the availability to that information. It's not necessarily proprietary, although it can be, and you can pay for some types of literature that you can get access to. Literature reviews have several objectives. One is that they're providing the background information, so they're giving you some idea of some of the things that have already gone into studying a particular concept or construct that you're interested in looking at, clarifying what it is that you're thinking about. So you may not be completely familiar with it, but that doesn't mean that nobody has gone out there and done that kind of research before. So this may give you some insight into whether or not there's other things going on that you can take advantage of just educating yourself. Then you can gets into looking at whether or not the information already exists that addresses specifically what it is that you're looking at. So if you're looking at, in particular, a concept, it might be a little bit more vague, or it might be a little bit more open-ended and give you a little bit of background. But specifically, maybe there is information out there that would be specific to the exact questions or set of questions that you're looking at. And then the other part of a literature review then will also help you to understand and suggest kind of the sampling or the way that you might want to either go about looking at collecting secondary data, or maybe even provide you with some ideas into collecting primary data. Another concept is identifying the sources of internal and external secondary data. So what's internal secondary data? That would be data that a company is already collecting. So lots of times you have scanner data. We all have some sort of a frequent buyer program that we participate in. That would be data that is being collected for one purpose, and the people that are collecting that data have that information. And then maybe you're exploring a new product or entry something into your store, into your retailing establishment. What this will do will be providing you with other kind of information that the data was not collected originally for the product that you're introducing, but it may give you some insight into your target. So internal secondary data is obtained within the company, and then external secondary data is obtained outside of the company. And again, there's all kinds of external data that you can have access to. If you go on and you go into even Google Scholar, or you do a Google search, you'll be able to find some external data. Now, the reliability of that or the biases of that information is what you might be calling into question. But there's lots of sources of secondary data just in government resources. So there's NAICS, there's different kinds of guidebooks. The Government Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics has all kind of information. It's all collected, they've collected it, and they provide the access to that information. Also thinking about discussing the conceptualization and the role in model development. So what's model development? This is when we have an idea of what it is that we want to look at, but we really need to kind of structure the different parts of what we're going to look at. So a conceptual model kind of is a summary of the relationship, or pictorially can represent how these relationships, how these different variables and constructs relate to each other. So it's if you're performing exploratory research, you may not know what all of these different relationships are. So pure exploratory research is really trying to get at some of what the underlying constructs and variables and ideas that people are, of the way that people are behaving, but you're not really quite sure what those different relationships are, or how those different variables relate to each other. As opposed to looking at and conceptualizing when it's not purely exploratory, now you're getting into some of the existing kinds of relationships that are more well known to researchers. And really what you're doing is you're saying, I understand what these relationships are, and now I'm really going to look at how I'm going to get at that information when I already know what these relationships are, what the existing relationships are. So when I'm looking at hypotheses and then independent and dependent variables, what am I talking about? So a variable is an observable item that's used on a questionnaire, and you're measuring something. So you've all answered questions on a questionnaire, on a survey, that ask you, how satisfied are you with something on a scale of 1 to 7. So that would be a variable that's trying to get at a better understanding of responses in a particular area. Now, a construct would be a series of questions that you might be asked that would be the variables then that make up the construct. So then those are considered to be unobservable concepts. because you've got the variables, and it's the combination of all of those variables then that makes up a particular construct. And then independent versus dependent. Independent variables you have are these relationships that are variables and constructs that have, you're trying to use those to explain your outcome or your dependent variable. So I'm looking at independent variables and I'm measuring those, and I'm using those to either predict or to explain what my dependent variable is. And that's the end of this chapter.